Welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am Ramita Iyer, Research Analyst at the Institute. The global space industry is currently estimated to be worth $350 billion and is projected to grow to more than $1 trillion over the next 20 years. The emergence of a growing space economy has unsurprisingly also led to crowding and competition in space. Among other countries, India has recently been rapidly expanding its space program, undertaking a series of steps to increase its capability and presence. To discuss India's space policy landscape and strategy, as well as the broader regional implications, I have with me Mr. Aditya Ramanathan, an associate fellow at the Takshashila Institution. Aditya, welcome to South Asia Chat.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
So, India's space industry has for long been under the public sector. But in recent times, the Modi government has taken several steps to liberalize and give a push to the domestic space industry. We saw in October 2021, the government launched the Indian Space Association, which looks at bringing in critical technology and investment into the country, alongside the formulation of a policy framework. Can you help our listeners understand the evolution of the Indian space industry and why the step to privatize has been taken now?
Sure. The To address why this step to privatize has been taken now, I think a lot of it has to do with the global context. So I would say that broadly, you have the global context of the emergence of a private space industry. You have, like you mentioned, an emerging space sector within India. And then there are finally the strategic implications of the rise of space economy. What does it mean for relative power in international relations? On the global space economy, like you pointed out, there's a Morgan Stanley estimate that the global space economy is worth about $350 billion, and that was from a few years back. And in about 20 years, it's estimated to be worth about $1 trillion, of which, whether or not that estimate comes true, what's really interesting to me about that is that about most of that new growth, so about 40% of that estimated 1 trillion, is expected to come from satellite internet, which is entirely private sector driven. So this is a sector where the expansion is likely to come from the private sector, right, rather uh, than from governments. And we're seeing this most evidently in the US, to a much less extent in China. SpaceX is obviously the most high profile example of private space sector. And what you see with SpaceX, as well as with other companies, Northrop and so on, is that they are essentially taking over a lot of older NASA roles in the US. So they're replacing the space shuttle, for example, with their own spacecraft. And they've taken over the role of, for example, ferrying crews and cargoes to the International Space Station. And in the future, in fact, NASA wants to replace the International Space Station itself with a number of privately run, privately manufactured, produced, and even launched space stations. And the idea being in the US, that you create a self-sustaining low Earth orbit economy, which would, in theory, allow NASA to focus on more ambitious programs, both to the moon and beyond, interplanetary missions and so on. Uh, and any if you're a policymaker in India, you are watching this and thinking about what it means for you. Uh, India's own space sector is supposed to be worth only about something like 2% of the global space economy. How you estimate that is very tricky, but yeah, it's a fairly small share. And you broadly have like three types of companies in India. So you have the established vendors, that have been supplying to ISRO, like Walchand Nagar Industries, Larsen and Toubro. You have smaller companies like Centum Electronics that have been making electronics for rockets really for the last 3 decades. And then you have transnational companies in new industries, of which I think OneWeb, where Bharati owns a major stake, is actually the sole example in India right now, but more such companies could prop up. And finally, you have the new space startups. There may be up to 120 of these, and a lot of these 120 are mostly are in the downstream sector. So you could divide space companies into so-called upstream and downstream. Upstream are the people involved in actually getting rockets into space, building satellites, and so on. Downstream are people back on Earth, monitoring satellites. doing providing ground services, doing image and data processing and analysis and so on. So in a country like India, you will find naturally a lot of new startups gravitating to the area where there is lower regulatory burden, like the downstream. And so you see this clear emergence of an Indian space sector. And if you're a policymaker in Delhi, you are thinking, I need to look for new avenues of economic growth in the country. The space sector is potentially a promising candidate. It holds the promise of both indigenously developed technology as well as transfers of technology. It can provide employment generation, and it also leverages existing strengths of India, such as information technology, IT enabled services. Uh, Now, and finally, there are the strategic implications, right? So if you define space power as the ability of a state to leverage its space related activities to wield power or influence in international politics, then, and if you consider that space power is going to become an important part of comprehensive national power, uh, then it means that you don't want to be left behind. And space power really incorporates, it's sort of like maritime power. It's an expansive definition. It incorporates commercial, military, and space and scientific activities in space. And you do not want to be left behind in this. You want to be a player. You don't want to be consigned to irrelevance. So yeah, I think those are broadly the drivers of privatization. Now, of course, actually getting that off the ground has been more complicated than uh, perhaps we would have liked. So you have had, for example, the introduction of a space activities bill in November 2017, but that bill had some problems, and I'm sure people from the space industry will have more to say about it than me. But fundamentally, that bill uh, did continue to see the government as the central driving force for all space activity in India. There's a lot of regulatory burden, a lot of licensing involved, disclosure requirements, and the bill makes it very easy for a space company to commit offenses, which is again, it's an open, basically it's open season for harassment. That type of provisions, especially in a country like India. Uh, and the bill also essentially absolved the government of any accountability of its own, which is again, it encourages uh, basically the creation of harassment or other sort of regulatory burdens for companies involved in the space sector. Now, to be fair, I think policymakers in Delhi are very well aware of these shortcomings of the bill, and so they are likely to incorporate changes to it. While it's been a few years, what we've seen since then is, of course, uh, the development, firstly, of an autonomous regulator for the space industry, sort of in the spirit of TRI for telecom and so on. So you have what's called Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center, or InSpace, as this autonomous regulator. This is an important step, and in fact, this we had at Takshashila had actually advocated for the creation of such a regulator, and we're really happy to see some of our ideas incorporated into it. Now, since the creation of InSpace in 2020, the impression, at least for us on the outside, is that things have slowed down. But that's typical in India. In India, you do see these things moving in fits and starts. So we do hope to see movement in the near future. The other thing, as you mentioned, Ramita, is the creation of Indian Space Association. ISPA or ISPA is supposed to be an industry body, or the prime industry body representing the space industry. There are other existing bodies like Satellite Industry Association and so on, but the fact that the Prime Minister, that then CDS of the armed forces, were there at the inauguration of ISPA, I think is a sign of how seriously the government takes the space industry, and it's perhaps an indication that this industry body will have the ear of the government, which is a great sign for the private sector.
Right, so privatization comes at a time when people are more dependent on space for their daily activities than they've ever been before. We're also witnessing the Indian space tech startup industry face an unprecedented boom. So, while spacefaring has been identified as a profitable venture, there are also concerns over the risks involved in it. Can you tell us about what these risks from commercialization that a country like India faces?
Sure. I think for India, it's almost early days yet to worry about the risks of commercialization of India's space sector. In fact, I'm afraid that we keep talking about the risks. We'll basically have, it'll slow down deregulation of the sector. But of course, like you pointed out, space is a heavily regulated sector, and there are clearly some good reasons for it. The very fact, unlike say with the IT industry, you're actually launching objects into space, for example. uh, there are clearances required from everything from the DGCA, which is the aviation regulator, to the Explosives Act in India, for storing and using of propellants. And then there are regulations on space itself, both domestic and international. So at the international level, there are broadly five laws that govern use of outer space, and most of these were created around a period of about a decade, from about 1967 to 1979. So there's the Outer Space Treaty, there's the Rescue and Return Agreement, there's a Liability Convention, a Registration Convention, and a Moon Agreement, which didn't have many takers for it, but India was one of them. Uh, and the one that concerns an Indian regulator is the Liability Convention, because this law was put down at a time when there was no commercial space industry, right? The idea of private space sector was essentially science fiction at that time. And so what it does is it basically makes a nation state liable for any damage, for example, that an object in space might cause. So if a satellite from India collides with a satellite from say France, then India is liable for the damage caused. And if debris from that satellite goes and hits other satellites, then India is liable for all of that damage. And Similarly, if a satellite or a spacecraft or something were to crash on Earth, debris were to hurt somebody or destroy property, again, that's that the liability lies exclusively with the nation state. Now, if you have a private satellite up there, how do you calculate that liability? How does government enforce that liability? If it's a transnational corporation, how do you assign it? What are the limits on the liability? So there are some, I think, very valid insurance concerns there that an Indian government would have. I think uh, the more immediate, broader concern is, like you mentioned, it's just that the orbits, and especially the low Earth orbit, is getting really crowded. So you have thousands of satellites in space. You have very unclear, what we would call end of life protocols. You have something like 4,500 satellites. You have tens of thousands of pieces of trackable debris. There is also smaller debris, typically less than 10 centimeters in size, which we really can't track. And all of this is it's hurtling in space. And if you're going to, for example, put up these huge constellations of internet, for satellite internet, for example, you have hundreds of satellites going up. It's going to make space a lot more crowded. And if you have this overcrowding in space, if satellites at the end of their life, if they're not being deorbited and re-entering the Earth's atmosphere harmlessly, and if they're going to be sitting there as space junk, you do create problems with basically you create risks for future space activity. So who's responsible then, for clearing this junk? If you create junk in space, what are your responsibilities? Can you be held accountable for, for example, if you're a private company and you have non-functioning satellites sitting up there in space occupying valuable orbits, are you liable? And if one of those satellites were to as its orbits degrade, were to hit another satellite, are you responsible? Is the country in which you're incorporated responsible? There are all these concerns around commercialization. There are back on Earth also, you do have some concerns. For example, there will be concerns inevitably about concerning ITAR, basically about weapons proliferation. Especially when you are sharing technology with other countries, these concerns are necessarily going to come up. And finally, even if you're a downstream company in India, uh, analyzing data from another country, uh, it's you know other countries might not want to share that data with you. So there are all these concerns that inevitably crop up, sorry, when you have a private space industry.
I want to focus a bit more on one of the things that you mentioned, that's space power. What are the likely implications of the growth of the space sector on aspects of power and security in international relations? What do globally disruptive events like the Russia Ukraine war mean for competition in space? And how does this affect a country like India?
Sure. Yeah. So space power, definitely the two most important components for me are the commercial aspect and the military aspect. Uh, and I think something like the Russia Ukraine war impinges on both. So, firstly, like I said, space power is both your ability to use space, that's primarily that, but it's also potentially your ability to deny the use of space or to others. So, what you're seeing is basically space is going to become one of the areas of high technology competition between major powers, and it's something in which India will want to be a player of its own right and build its own leverage. Uh, in terms of the Russia Ukraine war, we're already seeing some clear effects on India. So, for example, India is heavily dependent on Russia for its Gaganyaan human spaceflight project. That is almost certain to be disrupted, both because of the chaos within Russia's own space agency because of sanctions, but also because those sanctions can impinge on India's ability to cooperate with Russia. Similarly, uh, India is dependent on Ukraine for work on developing its semi-cryogenic engine, and that is also likely to get disrupted. In fact, apparently, one of the facilities in which these rockets are developed in Ukraine has been damaged during the course of this war. Uh, Besides this, there are also, I think, the war itself holds some clear concerns and hold some clear lessons for India. So, for example, the Ukrainians publicly requested some commercial space companies based in Western countries to provide them real time data for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance of Russian forces. And apparently, that data has been provided. There is a clear role for commercial players in a conflict like this. And what does that mean internationally? Can India's adversaries, even those that are not major space powers like Pakistan, leverage this commercial space power to improve their own military effectiveness? You also saw, for example, SpaceX once again set up, basically provide Starlink antennas to Ukraine. And apparently, the Ukrainians are using the Starlink satellite internet communication systems to coordinate, for example, uh, uh, drone strikes on Russian armor, and apparently, most recently, on some small Russian naval vehicles. Now, the question that arises in a situation like this is, does that make Starlink, for example, a legitimate target uh, for the Russians? Because it is apparently being used for military purposes by the Ukrainians. Uh, that's one part of the question, right? So when you have commercial entanglement from other countries in with a party in a conflict, what does that mean? Uh, there's also finally the question, for example, of the ubiquity of the US GPS system. So the fact that, for example, the Ukrainian forces are using American GPS once again to coordinate their own military operations, what does that mean? Does that provide the US with a source of leverage in this conflict? Uh, do the other Russians, for example, actually, informally using GPS themselves because their own GLONASS system is facing troubles of their own? GLONASS is the Russian satellite navigation system. So, all of these concerns do arise, and for India, it does have implications for how it thinks about space power, how it thinks about the role of the commercial space industry, and what it means for when you have entanglement between commercial players from other third parties and the party you're in conflict with.
So, the increasing focus on the Indo Pacific has also prompted more space activity. There is talk of a spillover of India China rivalry into space, with it soon emerging as an important domain of Sino Indian competition. Apart from this, we also saw at the first ever physical summit of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, which consists of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, where the leaders of the member states committed to new avenues of cooperation on outer space issues. What are your thoughts on these developments, and what does it mean for the regional architecture?
Sure. So on China and India, well, so 20 years back, the difference between China and India's space industry was much smaller. China has pulled ahead. Uh, so China has, it launches many more satellites every year than India. We've seen the rise of a commercial space industry. In China, and that's actually, it's involved not just in things like downstream, but actually involved in satellite launches and so on. And you've also seen in China, for example, the Chinese have basically matured their Baidu global navigation system. So the Chinese are able to provide a lot more public goods to countries in the region than India can. So it can both launch satellites specifically for other countries. Of course, India also does this, but the Chinese can do this at a larger scale. Uh, and the very fact that, for example, people in countries in India's extended neighborhood in the Indian Ocean region can potentially use China's Baidu navigation system for their regular commercial purposes means that China, rather than India, is the provider of those public goods. Now, in terms of the regional architecture with the Quad, I think it's a great development that the Quad has actually mentioned space as an important sector in which there needs to be an ongoing dialogue. Uh, on the Quad, so Quad is obviously India, the US, Australia, and Japan. Now, India is the odd one out in the Quad in the sense that the other three countries are treaty allies of each other, and it's much easier for those three countries, for example, to share technology between each other. But India is still indispensable in this grouping. So I think there are a few things that we can do. To me, the most ambitious uh, plan could be to actually have what my boss Nitin Pai calls bubbles of trust. So, the one area in which my colleagues are looking at creating bubbles of trust within the Quad is semiconductors. I think we can do something potentially similar in space. We can have create bubbles of trust for technology sharing, sharing of knowledge and expertise between the Quad states in order to develop and encourage the commercial space industries in these countries, and also encourage investment. Uh, we're seeing Australia has actually again started an initiative bilaterally with India to encourage Australian investments in India's commercial space sector. So, the groundwork for this is being laid. So I don't think it's all that far fetched. I think it's something that can be done. Uh, Besides that, I think the Quad needs to have an ongoing strategic dialogue on space. What we've been seeing really since 2007 is what I would call a ASAT renaissance. There's a renewal of testing of kinetic anti-satellite missiles. So this started uh, with China in 2007. America sort of responded, though in a sort of deniable way. Then India tested its own ASAT missile in 2019 February, Mission Shakti. And last year, we've had the Russians test again a direct ascent anti-satellite missile. Now, all of these tests are destructive tests. There have been other tests in between, but these destructive tests have created, have added to the debris problem in low Earth orbit because they've basically hit target satellites. And I think that this is an area in which the Quad countries can look at what the future holds. So, most recently, US Vice President Kamala Harris uh, declared that the US would not conduct such destructive anti-satellite tests again. I think there needs to be a dialogue in India about what that means for India. Should India also, declare its own moratorium on testing anti-satellite missiles destructively? Uh, you know. Is there space for India to do that? We need to have a strategic dialogue with the other Quad states about this. The other thing is, besides the sort of kinetic destroy things, sort of that type of space warfare, a lot of space warfare is likely to be non-kinetic, so that's likely to involve directed energy weapons like lasers, high-powered microwaves, as well as just electronic jamming and cyber attacks. So what are the rules and regulations that we should have in place uh, to govern responsible behavior in outer space. I think that this is something, for example, we are seeing UN sponsored open ended working groups uh, that is slated to begin discussing this later this month, May. uh, I think that it's important that the Quad states develop an ongoing strategic dialogue about what constitutes responsible behavior in space. Look at where they can come up with common negotiating positions, and also, discuss where they differ and why they differ on those issues, and try to work out those differences. Because the Quad states and the reason I'm saying this is simply because the Quad states do share a common concern about China and Chinese behavior in space. Uh, and it is in their interest to develop common negotiating positions that basically restrain potential Chinese aggression in space.
Well, thank you so much, Aditya, for being here and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get latest updates on our publications, events, and podcasts on social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.